The genesis of this panel is the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty's preamble literally says that space shall be used for the good of all mankind. And I think that is not something that we should just pay lip service to, but that is something that should guide our actions and how we approach working in space. And I feel like that's enough of an introduction to what I wanted to talk about today, so it's cool. So I will read you the introduction to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Mr. Christopher Ingraham. Christopher is the manager of stakeholder communications for the ISS National Lab, the International Space Station National Lab. He is responsible for fostering and maintaining relationships with government and industry stakeholders. Before this, he worked on Capitol Hill for 8 years, most recently for the Space and Science Subcommittee of the U.S. House. And before that, spent 4.5 years as the space policy advisor to then Congressman Jim Bridenstine, who is now the administrator of NASA. Christopher.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you to Chris Hearsey and the Space Frontier Foundation for putting this conference on. It's great to be here. We all are aware, those of us here at this conference are certainly aware of how space has transformed life on Earth. If you were up at Taylor's keynote over lunch, you heard her talk about some specific things, but just the transformation we've seen in communication, navigation, transportation, defense, disaster relief. I mean, the list goes on. And most of these developments, or many of these developments, were initially driven by governments. Space exploration drove tech development that ultimately manifested itself downstream in Earth-based applications that have improved life here on Earth. But as we all know, space is undergoing a transformation, both in terms of mindset and users, and it's no longer the domain of government only or even government first. And a similar transformation is happening on the ISS. The ISS was first conceived as a tool of diplomacy, of international relations, and as the kind of the next program to do long-term human spaceflight. But now it's being used as a destination for world-class microgravity, R&D, and private sector activity. And this is really due to the fact that in 2005, the U.S. operating segment of the ISS was designated a national lab by Congress in order to open up the ISS to the American people beyond just NASA's mission. And then in 2010, Congress decided that it wanted to make more explicit the fact that there's a bright line between NASA's work on the ISS and all the other work that can be done up there by the United States citizens. So they wanted a separate independent entity to manage that work being done by government agencies, academic and nonprofits, and the private sector. And so that's where my organization comes in. ISS National Lab, we were selected to be the space integrator for the ISS, enabling all this non-NASA work. We are not-for-profit, non-governmental, and single-purpose, and we manage 50% of the R&D resources on the ISS. And when I say that, I'm talking about the up-mass to station, down-mass, crew time, communications, power, you name it. We're responsible for utilizing half of that to specifically benefit life on Earth through economic development, discovery, and innovation. While NASA is focused on its exploration mission, we're focused on bringing those benefits back to humanity. Now, NASA's mission has undoubtedly led to benefits on Earth, but a lot of times that's been indirect and downstream. But at the National Lab, we're focusing on R&D in space that has a clear line of sight to industrialization. Essentially, we want to chaperone science to the point where it can be taken and developed into products and services that improve the human condition. Over our history, since 2011 when we started, we have sent nearly 400 projects to station. In fact, if SpaceX 18 goes off on time and everything goes well on Sunday, we will be right at about 400. And we've seen some really interesting and promising science in a few areas. The first is biomedicine and then also advanced materials. And many of these results have been due to basic science sponsored by other government agencies like the NIH and NSF and by private companies. For example, protein crystallization projects that have been able to grow larger and more uniform and stable crystals that have led to better understanding of how kind of diseases form. Tissue on a chip program that the NIH has sponsored that has shown that you can grow bigger clusters of cells that won't collapse like they do if you try to do this in gravity. And then certain materials like Zeblan that can't be produced in gravity but have shown themselves to potentially be a lot more efficient at transmitting data than the current materials we use to make fiber optic cables. And then also the National Lab offers a unique vantage point to do Earth observation and remote sensing. And I think some of my fellow panelists will talk more about this, but The fact that the ISS National Lab is in orbit, it's an orbital platform. We've launched some projects that have taken advantage of this, such as a project that we launched in 2013 called CIMUS that studies cyclone intensity. So it's not just microgravity, but all the characteristics of having a space-based national lab that make this beneficial to the United States, to the world. And we want to expand on the areas that utilize the uniqueness of a space-based national lab. And we want to take what we've learned through our history over the past 7 or 8 years and really build programs that focus on these areas, support scientific iteration and strategic roadmaps, and drive towards tangible endpoints. We want to really build the business case for doing R&D, for undertaking an R&D enterprise in space, because we believe at the National Lab that focused, targeted investment in the industrialization of low Earth orbit will kick into overdrive the benefits to humanity we've already seen from space. Basic science is important, will always be supported by the National Lab, does lead to discovery, but at the same time, the American people have invested heavily in the ISS, the world has invested heavily in the ISS, and we've seen great promise from certain areas of R&D, so it's time for humanity to really benefit from this. So it's critical for the nation to maintain a space-based national lab capability that can support the microgravity R&D continuum and ensure that basic and applied science and applied research is driven towards improving life on Earth. So with that, I'll turn it over and look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Christopher. All right, our next speaker is Dr. Anne-Marie Kimball. She's a physician epidemiologist and senior consulting fellow at Chatham House. She served as technical and strategic lead for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Surveillance Strategy Formation as a senior program officer with the foundation. Prior to Gates, she served as professor of epidemiology at the University of Washington School of Public Health, where she is now Emerita. At UW, Dr. Kimball founded and directed the APEC Emerging Infections Network and led research and training programs in Peru and Thailand. She was awarded a Fulbright New Century Scholarship and is a Guggenheim Scholar. She's the author of Risky Trade, Infectious Diseases in an Era of Global Trade. Prior to joining UW, she served as regional advisor for HIV/AIDS and head national program support for the Pan American Health Organization and World Health Organization. Returning to Washington, she served as the director for the Washington State AIDS Program, Department of Health, Washington State. She chaired the National Alliance of State and Territorial AIDS Directors. She serves on numerous boards and advisory groups. I'm like running out of breath.
That's okay.
And is extensively published. She's a fellow in the American College of Preventive Medicine. Dr. Kimball.
My mother would be proud of that. Thank you. Well, I'm clearly not a space person per se, but I think I've been invited to talk with you about some of the applications that we do use, particularly Earth observation for, and in our work. And I'm frankly mostly an infectious disease person, and I'm mostly an outbreak person, and I'm mostly a new infection person. So that's kind of my niche in my world. I taught emerging infections at the University of Washington for 20 years. In fact, I started the course because nobody was teaching it. And there's a variety of them. One of them is causing us a particular problem right now, which is Ebola in the Democratic Congo, Republic of Congo, DRC. I used to ask my students as they entered the class, I gave them a sort of a scenario, there's an outbreak of Ebola in a very remote part of sub-Saharan Africa. Does this pose a global threat? And it was interesting because the students were about 50-50. Half the students said, oh no, they don't have any airplanes, they're not going to bring Ebola, it's not very infectious. And it's been interesting to watch the more recent Ebola outbreaks in West Africa and now in DRC. So a couple days ago, after Taylor asked me to be on this panel, I contacted a friend of mine who works a lot with that particular outbreak, which, as you all know, was just declared a fake. We have our jargon too, right? A fake is a public health event of international concern. This is a big deal in the international health regulations, which is the only treaty that actually tells countries what they can do during a pandemic or during an outbreak in terms of trade, travel, and quarantine. So my friend was telling me that they are very much using remote sensing and looking at locations where they can put Ebola centers. But more than that, they're using them most profoundly for security of health workers in the DRC, because they are working near Goma and north of Goma, which is a conflict zone with lots of militias. So as much as they're using them to sort of look at terrestrial foresting and where there may be bats and where there are settlements of humans, they're also looking at where there may be threats from human to human, which is an interesting part of some of the kind of work that goes on there. So I'll just kind of give you an overview of some of the areas which I'm sure you're familiar with, and then we can have a deeper discussion if you like during the discussion period. So basically, global health has really changed from when I started, which was back in the 80s. It used to be extremely medical. You used to have to almost be a doctor to be in this field. And now it's really gotten a lot more integrated, and we're working on what we call precision global health, which integrates new technologies such as Earth observation, large databases, all of these other trends from technology that are coming in, but also new vaccines like you're seeing deployed in the DRC and several other kinds of things. But what we quite haven't gotten a hold of yet, frankly, is how you gain community trust. And that's kind of a theme that I want you to remember as we talk about some of the great satellite-based innovations that are helping us to remotely manage and remotely sense what's going on in a location. It still requires building community trust. And to date, we haven't been that effective in getting our technologies to help us with that critical piece. So just for example, we mostly use it for risk identification, and that would be true in a disaster situation, that would be true in a flood situation, and post-earthquake situation. But also in infectious diseases, we can actually map where forests are, we can map where habitats are, and that's a great assistance. During the polio eradication campaign and the malaria eradication campaign, which are still going on, in polio, the last pockets of polio were in countries such as Nigeria, Kano, and Kaduna in the north of Nigeria, where there's no addresses and there are very transient settlements of people. So finding out where the under fives are that you want to vaccinate is very difficult. And that was a key place where remote sensing was used. The second place in the polio campaign was, where do you put the swabs? We use swabs in sewerage drain-off to detect polio virus in effluent. And so the Japanese were able to do some elegant mapping of settlements and really put those swabs where that phenomenon occurred to do the maximum surveillance for the village after the polio clinically was eradicated. So that's polio. And then, of course, in malaria, as with any other vector-borne disease, malaria coming from mosquitoes, you want to know where the mosquitoes live, and then you want to be able to do a risk assessment and say, well, how many resources do we need here? How many resources do we need there, given that you don't have enough resources ever to do everything everywhere? And so that's really been a lot of remote sensing work that's been done, looking at Earth observation imagery for that kind of habitat identification. For, in the case of Ebola, it would be bats. In the case of malaria, it's mosquitoes. And of course, now we're also looking at neglected infectious diseases, which are very obscure. And if I start using all of these these names, you'll get lost pretty quickly. But like Loa Loa and chikungunya, et cetera, those have different vectors, and each of those vectors, be it a mosquito, be it a certain kind of animal, live in a certain space. And we're using a lot of risk identification work for that. Of course, climate change is changing our world rapidly. It's changing our world in where we see infectious diseases, and that's happening fairly rapidly too. When you combine some of the heat island phenomenon of urban populations and increasing pavement and coverage, and you also have climate change superimposed on that, you're beginning to see diseases in places we never saw them before, as the vectors tend to move out of the tropics and into the temperates. And that's a phenomenon we're seeing, and the other aspects of climate change with increasingly hectic weather patterns, which takes you into disaster response, et cetera. So with all of the havoc we're wreaking with our climate, I think they're going to keep us all in business for quite a while in global public health. Unfortunately, we always thought we would work our way out of business. So I guess I'll just leave you with the idea that this is a tremendous resource, and in my discipline, for about the last 15 to 20 years, increasingly we've been able to use the more and more granular satellite-based Earth imagery to assist our work, combined with remote sensing, terrestrially based, but it still doesn't obviate the human factor that we also need in our work, so I'm not out of a job yet. But I really look forward to your questions, and I'll answer as many as I can, because I think it's a fascinating area for collaboration. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kimball. And our final speaker today is my boss. So everybody, please be nice. Mr. John David is the Director of National Security Science and Technology at LMI. LMI is also where I work. It is a not-for-profit dedicated to helping the federal government solve its toughest problems. Previously, he was the Director of CWMD and Life Sciences at Torrey. And he's formerly trained as a microbiologist and served as a naval officer for 13 years. So, boss man.
Thank you, Taylor. And thank you also to the Space Frontier Foundation for letting me get up on the soapbox. I was thrown in as not Peter. Oh, but they found a picture of me anyway. So Taylor had asked me to talk this morning when I showed up here. And what was I talking about?
The business case.
Yes, the business case for humanitarian applications of space. So from the bio, you can tell that I'm wholly unqualified to actually tell you anything. I work for a not-for-profit, so a business case is probably remote, and I have no space in my background. On the other hand, what I can tell you is that from what I've heard today here at the conference and this, the fellow panelists up here, I'd like to approach this from a matter of risk. Travel to space, working within the space industry presents a lot of risk. Every one of those risks that you undertake in your industry represents an opportunity. And all of those opportunities represent money. And all of that is the business case for what we do everywhere we do it. In all of the work that I do, looking at the risks that the government is taking is what turns into money for the business that I do. So as we look at, and by the way, I have no prepared paper, so I'm going to go off the cuff here. And Taylor said I had 5 minutes to do whatever damage I can. So as we look at that, the risk environment that's going on in the space industry, how do you turn that back to Earth and look at the Earth and say, how do I approach that from a business perspective in making a few dollars here? As the ISS National Lab looks at doing and moving those technologies back to Earth, every company, your strategy, your operation should be about doubling down on making money for your company. And you can do that by the space side of things, and you can also take a look at Earth and say, how can I do that here? One of the important things is moving water. You have to get water to space. You have to utilize water efficiently in space. There are a whole lot of places here on Earth, probably even here in California, where water is critical. How do you do that? How do you make money out of that risk? There is opportunities for other things like making sure that water is clean. That's another opportunity. So all of these things that end up being part of the space side of things end up being a possibility here on Earth as well. It's up to companies as the commercial side of space takes off to look at all of those things and say, where can I benefit myself and my company? And the reason this is part of this and the humanitarian applications is as I sat and listened to the overview panel talk about things, and they talked about how following the overview effect, and you get to space, and there's this EPA and Greenpeace and the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act and all those things that came around that are really good for the planet. I looked at that and said, this is a planet of people. Where are the things that we're doing for the people that are on Earth with all the technologies? And we have, from Taylor's talk, Velcro and Teflon and the other things, and of course Star Trek, which is good for people. But we need more. We need more of that from the companies that are out here working within the space industry, because all of those applications have things that work here on Earth for the people that are here, and not just for the few people that can afford them. So I think that's, I guess the end of that would be there's a call for action in this for companies to look for ways that make them profitable, because the more profit we make here on Earth, the more work we can do with space. Thank you.
So as moderator, I'm going to take my privilege to run this and do things a little bit differently from a traditional panel. Because I find when I come to panels that I listen to people and I come up with a lot of ideas and I'm sort of bursting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys a couple of 3 minutes, talk to your neighbors, kind of digest what you've just heard. And if you are thinking of a question, kind of workshop it with your neighbor. I'm a little bit mean in that I really, really want questions and not commentary or stories. Sorry, I know I told stories at lunch. But I'm going to give you guys a couple of minutes to talk about that, and then I'll take moderator's privilege, ask 1 or 2 questions, and then turn it over to you guys, okay? Thank you. I am going to take moderator's privilege and ask a couple of really quick questions. And the first one is just for Christopher, sorry. But the ISS is due to age out of service in the next couple of years. So what is the plan moving forward, or is there a plan yet?
So I think from is my mic back on? Okay, there we go. I think from a technical perspective, it's been determined that from a physical structure, the ISS could last into the 2030s, potentially to 2040, I think, depending on who you ask. So that's not really an issue. The issue is the policy behind it, the politics, the market. I think from our perspective, from my organization's perspective, we think that the ISS needs to be, the authorization for it needs to be extended by Congress past 2024, the current end date, because 5 years from now is not long enough to support the types of investment needed, to support the scientific R&D cycle. People are not going to put money into a program of iterative science that will take, years to do if halfway through their program, exactly. So for us, we'd like to see it extended. We're grateful that at least some folks, like the Senate, has multiple bills that extended to 2030. Hopefully they can get their act together and work with the House and get that done. So yeah, we would like to see the ISS extended to at least 2028, 2030, just beyond 2024.
Fantastic. And then I only have one other question, then I'll turn it over to the room. But my other question is for everybody. During our little break, we were talking a little bit about collaboration. And as somebody who's done a lot of different things and worked in a lot of different industries, the thing I learned most is that I can't be an expert in everything, no matter how hard I try. And so I learned that I really have to collaborate with people if I want to get anything done. How do you think we should move forward trying to encourage collaboration between the space industry and other industries? Easy questions. I ask easy questions.
Between the space industry and other industries, and you mean global health?
For you, sure, global health. Yes, let's go with that. For example.
It's complicated because what we're also embracing right now is an increasing infusion of intellectual excitement, vigor, contribution from the global south, which up until now had been largely marginalized. And so we're working through a lot of cross-cultural and leadership issues in that arena in our own house. So I think how to approach is complicated, and when I look at people's reluctance to share their research in academia, much less their proprietary information in industry. And I look at some of our organizations for whom information sharing is absolutely critical in the way we have to work. I can understand the reluctance, and it's going to take some work to work out those relationships to preserve everybody's agenda. On the other hand, I think it's extremely exciting because I see nothing but progress in this area for global health.
I think it involves proving that there's a there for other industries to do work in space. I mean, if you look at the space, like the space economy, the biggest kind of sectors of it that are the most vibrant are, launch, remote sensing, and communications, where business cases have closed or have started to close, but if you kind of really dig into it, I mean, government is really supporting those, are the biggest customers of those sectors. So even there's still a lot of, it needs that huge customer to really survive. So for us, that's why we want to utilize the resource that we have from the American people in the form of, half of this ISS to show what kinds of things can be done and enabled by microgravity, so that other industries want to go and invest their funds into it. And so that's why we're trying to kind of really focus on things like medicine and advanced materials, things that can really be transformed by space.
So for me, being naive in the environment, I would say my first question is always, what is the space industry? Where are the boundaries there? How do you say there's another industry out there when everything that's done on Earth touches the space industry somewhere? So it's really a matter of letting them know that they're already a part of the space industry, and they should just come to the table and be there. It's not, there isn't a thing that's done that doesn't impact what happens in the space industry. From human capital to resource management, risk mitigation, all of that is part of what goes on in a day-to-day environment in the space industry. So all those industries are playing already.
All right, it's now going to open it to you guys for questions. Yes, sir.
So,
They've got a mic coming.
We might be able to hear you, but everybody else.
my comment is, I find a big gap in space power in space.
Microphone?
I have a big gap.
And could you introduce yourself as well, please, sir?
I'm Rob Fryer, and we do green launch, so we're a small launch company. I find a big gap in powering things in space. In solar, when we talk about various propulsion methods, we turn to solar power because we know how it works, it's available, know how to do it. But it seems clear to me that we're going to need atomic power in space. And the only project I've heard is I call it the 100 kilowatt NASA program, which is going to, they want a space-rated small power source for space. But I think it's really important to have multiple ways of powering things in space. And we've got chemistry, we've got solar power, and I think that some kind of atomic power is very important for I call them space tugs or going to Mars. In other words, having a large amount of power increases your options. I'm just saying. So that's all I have.
Thank you for that. Does anybody have a question? Oh, in the back.
Hi, Luke Bologna here. I wonder if you guys had any comment on, from a humanitarian perspective, how can we ensure an orderly, ethical, and fair sort of like colonization of the solar system as we, as I hope, expand into the solar system and beyond? How do we ensure human rights work on Europa and, people have, I don't know, land rights on Venus when you can't land on it? That's my question. I don't really have any observations on that.
Yeah, so from a technical standpoint, you can't have land rights in space, but...
Well, you know how successful we've been in our human rights agenda here on Earth and the human colonization of all the land masses that we do occupy, and we're moving up towards 9 billion people. We have some lessons learned. I don't think there's a magic bullet that's going to work better in space than it has worked on Earth, which has been a real slog. And I think we have to recognize that we have a ways to go. So I think setting up your institutions and trying to bring your lessons learned, but you're going to really struggle with equity, and you're going to struggle with all the things we struggle with on Earth. Just because you move, you don't get a geographic cure in space. So I guess that's all I could say. I do think it's important to be conscious of the fact that there's a certain piece of our population that has access to space exploration at this point. That's getting more general with China and India and some other large middle-income countries getting in the game, Brazil and others. But there's a whole lot of countries that will never have any space exploration. So I think the kind of enfranchisement work that perhaps they're doing at the International Space Station is that kind of negotiation across countries and peoples that's going to be necessary.
Christopher, John?
Yeah, so the question was, how do we make sure that it's equitable and fair? And I think that we have an opportunity for a test bed for that. We have humanitarian needs here on Earth, and as Emery said, we have a poor record of providing equity here on Earth. So as we look at how we would do that in space, and I don't have an answer for you, what I have is the thought that as we think about how to do that, as we come to an understanding of there's a need to do that, we have the opportunity to do test beds here on Earth. How do we take that thought and put it into practice here on Earth? We have an opportunity to see how that would work, to see how you can make sure that there is a fair and equitable transition of technology to sub-Saharan Africa or to remote parts of Tibet. There's ways to do that to make sure that when we do get to space, we already have that plan in place.
Christopher, anything? It's a hard question. Were there any other questions? I know there's someone over. Yes.
Jeremy Wainscott, Alliance for Space Development. I suspect this will be mostly for Chris, but anyone else feel free to chime in. So regardless of when the ISS goes extended through, with it 2024, 2030s, whatever, sooner or later it will have to be replaced. And I know there are a lot of people, and I count myself among them, that would like to see the replacement or replacements, plural, as being commercially, if not commercially run, then commercially provided. I guess a two-part question. One, what would you like to see as the eventual replacement for ISS? And as a follow-up to that, how important do you think it would be to make sure there is no gap in between that would possibly affect research going on at the space station? Thank you.
So I'll answer your second question first. It's absolutely critical that there isn't a gap in LEO access. Critical. Need whatever transition happens, it needs to be. We need to avoid what happened with the shuttle retirement, and the fact that for the United States, we don't have our own domestic capability to get to the space station. We shouldn't have that. We shouldn't have that happen with platforms. In terms of replacement, I think we also, from our organization's perspective, would also like to see commercial habitats come on. I don't think it's necessarily inappropriate for government-focused labs to be up there. I think we'd like all of the above, like a lot of options, depending on what type of work needs to be done. I think the biggest key to the transition is making sure that needs of users and future users are considered before we do it. And I think that's, as NASA rolls out this, the LEO development program that they announced about a month ago, and announced that they're going to do solicitations for the commercial node on the space station and then eventually free flyers, making sure that we're not doing a build it and they will come scenario where we build a capability and then try to find people to use it. We need to have those conversations at the beginning. So for us, that's what's key in any transition to follow on to the ISS.
So I'm going to add on to that for you two, because this is an area that I've done a little bit of work and research in, and is also to me of great concern. The ISS currently serves as a public good. We do national lab work up there, we do research, and we use it for diplomacy. What happens and what are the pros and cons of privatizing or commercializing public goods? How do we minimize the cons and maximize the pros? I told you, I asked the easy questions.
Well, I think that's an excellent question. You know, a global public good is non-rivalrous and it's not depleted, and then when you get into a private good, it's different. I think the difficulty is, you know, when we say humanitarian, we mean the human community. And why do we do things? We do things because we value human life, we value our families, we value our health. So it's always been curious to me why we don't do things with that motivation and we focus so exclusively on profit. Let me give you an example. I mentioned the Ebola outbreak, right? This isn't the first. In fact, the first Ebola outbreak was in 1976. And that's a long time ago. And in that intervening 40 years of time plus, there was one more Ebola outbreak that we'll all know about, and then a few smaller ones. There was absolutely no progress in diagnostics. There was no progress in vaccines. There was no progress in medicines. Ask yourself why that is. I mean, this is a disease that has a 70% mortality rate. I mean, it's a terrible disease. And it wipes out, you know, communities of people. And the reason that didn't happen was because there was no commercial market for the product, right? So to an extent, we have to balance that. So I think that the hardest thing would be to assure that your global public good continued to address the needs of the human community as you commercialize it, rather than simply going where the money is. I mean, money's a nice, you know, titer of making some progress, but you can really get yourself down the wrong track if that's the total focus of what you're doing with an overall effort to do good, as they say in economics. So that would be, you know, that's where regulation comes in, that's where negotiation comes in. I'm fascinated to learn more about the ISS, because when you go on international missions, you do the same thing about, you know, who's going to do this, who's going to do that, and you're working across different nations and different assumptions and different languages. We need those skills, but we also need a really clear focus on what is the greater good, and whether we get there publicly or whether we get there privately or whether we get there with a nice cooperation between the two, which is often the best way to do it. I think that should be our destination.
And if I could add something real quick, something I mentioned in my opening statement that I just want to kind of foot stomp. When we're talking about the privatization of the ISS or whatever comes next in LEO, something that I think is important from a policy perspective is to maintain a space-based national lab capability, kind of evolve. Right now, the national lab is tied to the physical vehicle that is the ISS. That, as we're talking about ISS transition, a piece of this conversation which hasn't been as talked about is, okay, what's the future of the national lab then? And I think that really needs to be evolved beyond the physical structure of the ISS to be able to support microgravity R&D across platforms, because as Dr. Kimball was saying, there's a need for R&D beyond just profit. I mean, I think eventually things can be taken from that potentially and brought down that road, but there will always be a need for kind of government sponsored or public-private partnership sponsored R&D, and so we need a national lab capability in space beyond the ISS.
So I would go a little bit further and say there's always going to be a need for government presence in space. There isn't a model that I can point to that says commercialization has been wholly successful without having some level of government interaction within that. You can talk about the notion of running hospitals as being government and then moving over to being private. So there are models that work where you've taken from a not-for-profit environment and turned it into a profit environment that still provides some level of greater good. But there has to be that collaboration and some oversight. The government needs to provide that level of oversight that says, you're probably not going to end up doing this, focus more towards something else. That said, there still needs to be a opportunity for those commercial entities to turn a profit, as they need to do that to ensure stakeholders and other things continue to happen. That they have the money that they use in that profit to do more research and development, to do more growth. So there's a commercial application that's possible, but you don't walk away. The government can't just walk away from space just because the ISS has reached its max in 2024.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. We've got one back here,
One down.
and we'll come to you.
Hi, I'm Robert Peter, volunteer at the conference. In terms of international cooperation, participation, and diplomacy in regards to the ISS, what is your opinion about China not being able to participate?
Oh, I'm so glad I'm the moderator.
I mean, it's really tough because, one of the biggest issues that we have as the National Lab in getting kind of private investment private entities to invest in R&D is the issue of intellectual property and being able to control it and have it, and because I mean that's the biggest asset in the early stage of any kind of development process, right? And I mean, the Chinese don't have a great track record in respecting that and respecting those rights, so it's tough. And I mean, I think ultimately maybe being able to bring them in could have benefits, but I think there's a lot of other issues that need to be kind of hammered out before that happens. And there's also other kind of geopolitical kind of tensions outside of space that I think would have to be solved before it can trickle down to collaboration in space. That's like way above my pay grade, but yeah.
Any thoughts to add, or? It's very diplomatically put. I believe we have one more question down front.
Thank you. My name is Eric Robinson. I'm from Green Launch. And I think that one thing that's common, for both colonization of Moon, Mars, and Earth is we need clean, continuous, safe, abundant energy, low cost. And the good news is, and plus Dr. Kimball mentioned, we're going to 9 billion people here, and that there's a global warming problem. So the good news is that the system actually was solved in the 60s with the Kennedy administration advocating it. My parents and grandparents' money paid for it, but yet we're not getting it. And it happened at the National Lab at Oak Ridge, and both the Chinese and India, the biggest countries in the world, are actually working on this technology too. And we've had a little bit of, the door is kind of squeaking open a little bit. The energy power is thorium. The thorium is abundant. We're the second largest thorium source in the world next to India. It's on the moon, it's on Mars, it's mineable. I mean, a ball of the size of a golf ball is enough for your whole life. But why isn't that, if we're really worried about global warming, why isn't thorium-powered energy being pushed to the highest and the fastest track possible in this country today? You're the National Lab guy, you tell me. I mean, there is some money being spent at Pacific National Northwest Lab now, I know right now. But really, if you could get people involved in this, this would solve all these problems and also bring the standard of living for everybody in the whole planet, out of the dirt.
I think just for us in terms of testing energy sources on the ISS National Lab, we're going to run into problems with safety and things like that. So that makes it difficult for us to kind of delve into those types of research. We're limited because we've got to keep the crew and the vehicle safe. And when you're talking about things like that, when we talk about studying nuclear propulsion or other types of things, you're talking about things that are kind of outside of what we could really do on the ISS National Lab. Yeah.
All right, so we have just a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask, we have one more question. Okay.
Blaine Lepdal. One of the common themes among a lot of humanitarian efforts, since they are generally globally administered, is that they're usually go through some sort of organization like the World Health Organization or the United Nations. Right now we've got a lot of different groups that are kind of working in different areas, and they're typically government sponsored. Do you think it makes sense for something like an organization like the United Nations or a global organization to start standing up the infrastructure to be able to address some of these humanitarian issues that are going to eventually come up?
So I'm going to ask you guys to answer that and also wrap in your final thoughts really quickly.
I'll let you go first.
Well, there is a global architecture, just to answer your question, under the United Nations. The WHO is a technical agency of the United Nations. UNDP is a development agency of the United Nations. The World Bank is affiliated, but not part of the same UN structure. So there is global governance in some sense. It has its limits, and let me be very clear that you cannot generalize from a situation in DRC Congo to a situation in Yemen, to a situation in Peru, to a situation in Thailand. I mean, having worked in each of those places, local enablement is absolutely critical, and community-based involvement is absolutely critical. And so what we've learned, I think, is there isn't one size fits all, and that's where some of these global architecture breaks down. Now, whether space should be part of or is part of a global United Nations sort of structure, I think it already is in the Space Treaty with what, you have 190 signatories on that, or something in that neighborhood, some signatories and some not ratified. And that's a lot of work to get just there. So there is a forum. I don't know how generalizable things will be from the moon to Venus to, that's a little beyond my discipline.
I think the scope of my organization again is Earth focused. So whatever existing paradigms or frameworks that kind of govern activities on Earth, we're just trying to make sure that things that space can bring new types of applications back down that could potentially fit into those types of things.
So the way I understood your question was whether or not there should be a global governmental organization that provides oversight. Is that what you were looking for? We're getting a stop sign, but I'm going to keep going. Right.
Can you turn your mic on? I can't.
So he's saying there's supposed to be a global structure.
Right. So within that context, the same way that I answered the question about the ISS, there is, and as Dr. Kimball pointed out, a global structure that exists for addressing humanitarian issues. The governmental node always needs to be there, but I really think it's down to the things that we don't hear about, the corporations that are doing things, the multinationals that are doing things, like Taylor pointed out earlier, Coca-Cola, Starbucks. A lot of those companies have corporate social responsibility officers whose job is to make sure that as Jindal Stainless in India buys up land, that the farmers that are displaced have work to do, have an equitable way of sharing in the wealth that is being created. So all of those things are happening. They may not get the press.
I understand that. The question is the extension of that
To space. I think the model applies there as well. So as you move into replacement or duplication of the ISS, if those are commercial entities, the same model would apply.
So this is a topic that I could talk about for a really long time, particularly because I teach it. But I want to thank you guys for your engagement and your questions. They were thoughtful and relevant. I really appreciated that. I would like to thank Dr. Emery Kimball, Mr. Christopher Ingraham, and especially Mr. John David, my boss, who stepped in at the last minute. This has been an amazing panel, and I'd like to thank Chris Hersey and the NewSpace Foundation the Space Frontier Foundation for having us. Thanks.